for tonight's lecture, we will be discussing about pediatric rheumatology. So, rheumatic diseases refer to a diverse group of chronic conditions characterized by persistent inflammation. These diseases commonly affect the musculoskeletal system, such as your joints, muscles, and bones, but can also involve the blood vessels and other organs. In many cases, the exact cause remains unknown, although immune-mediated mechanisms play a very major role. So, it is very important to emphasize that children are not simply small adults. Pediatric rheumatic diseases often differ in presentation, progression, and response to treatment compared to adults. This highlights the need for a distinct approach when evaluating and managing these conditions in children. So in practice, we group these conditions based on their dominant clinical and immunologic patterns rather than on a single laboratory marker. This helps guide both diagnosis and treatment. So first, we have your juvenile idiopathic arthritis, or JIA, which is defined by chronic arthritis in children. It is an umbrella term with multiple subtypes, each with different patterns of joint involvement, laboratory findings, and risks such as uveitis. The unifying feature is the persistent synovitis or arthritis. Second are the systemic autoimmune diseases such as your systemic lupus erythematosus and juvenile dermatomyositis. These conditions typically involve multiple organs and are driven largely by adaptive immunity regulation. Autoantibodies are often present and can assist in the classification. Third are autoinflammatory syndromes, but we will not be discussing this because this is far technical. So this is just nice to know. So these disorders are primarily disorders of the innate immune system. These patients often present with recurrent fevers and systemic inflammation without high titer autoantibodies. Many are cytokine-driven and in some cases genetically mediated. And finally, we have our vasculitides. So, vasculitides are characterized by inflammation of the blood vessels. Depending on the size and distribution of the vessels involved, patients may present with skin findings, renal involvement, neurologic symptoms, or GI manifestations. It is important to remember that these categories are conceptual frameworks. In real clinical practice, there is overlapping, and patients may not fit neatly into one of these boxes, but this structure helps us think systematically and approach evaluation and management more effectively. So, we have our first disease. SLE is a chronic autoimmune disease characterized by multi-system inflammation. It is marked by the presence of autoantibodies where the immune system mistakenly targets the body's own cells and tissues. SLE can affect both children and adults, but it is more common in females, particularly of those of reproductive age. Because it is a multi-system disease, it can involve the skin, joints, kidneys, blood, and even the CNS, leading to a wide range of clinical presentations. SLE in children shows a strong female predominance, similar to adult SLE, although this difference becomes more pronounced after puberty. In terms of epidemiology, the incidence ranges from about 0.3 to 2.5 per 100,000 children, while the prevalence is estimated at 1.1 to 9.7 per 100,000. Although pediatric SLE can occur at any age, it is increasingly seen after the first decade of life, particularly during adolescence. Clinically, SLE tends to present more aggressively. Pediatric SLE tends to present more aggressively compared to adult-onset disease. Common manifestation would include your fever, lymphadenopathy, reflecting systemic inflammation, hematologic abnormalities such as anemia, leukopenia, or thrombocytopenia are also frequently observed. Importantly, organ involvement is more common and often more severe in children. especially lupus nephritis, which is a major concern and significantly contributes to morbidity. Other serious manifestations would include your pericarditis, neuropsychiatric involvement such as seizures, psychosis, and ocular symptoms. So moving on to the pathogenesis of SLE, it develops due to a complex interplay of genetic, environmental, and immunologic factors. So some patients are genetically predisposed, like defects in their complement protein or immune regulation. And also there are environmental triggers, such as your UV light, infection, or hormones that can activate the disease. After which, the immune system becomes dysregulated. Dendritic cells activate your T cells and your B cells, and the normal brakes of the immune system don't work properly. Then the B cells produce autoantibodies like your anti-dsDNA. This binds to self-antigens, forming immune complexes that circulate in the blood. These immune complexes then deposit into the tissues, your skin, kidneys, joints. They activate complement, leading to inflammation and tissue injury. This causes symptoms like rash, nephritis, arthritis, and CNS disease. So, with the chronic inflammation, this leads to permanent damage such as your renal failure, atherosclerosis, fibrosis, and stroke. So, these are the clinical and laboratory features suggestive of childhood onset SLE. Most patients present insidiously with non-specific symptoms such as your fever, weight loss, fatigue, arthralgia, which develops over weeks to months. However, some children may present acutely with life-threatening disease like your lupus nephritis, neuropsychiatric lupus, thrombosis, or macrophage activation syndrome. The key point is that the diagnosis is often delayed because symptoms can be subtle. For example, arthritis may be non-painful, classic malar rash may be absent or difficult to recognize. So, here are some of the features. So as you can see, this is your malar rash, discoid rash, alopecia, oral ulcer. Note that the oral ulcers in SLE are often painless. So patients do not usually volunteer that information, so you have to check their palate always. And right knee arthritis. So when we talk about diagnosing SLE, it is important to remember that these are classification criteria. Mainly used for research, but they are very helpful in guiding our clinical diagnosis. So we will go through three main criteria. So first, we have the American College of Rheumatology criteria from 1997. So this includes 11 clinical and immunologic features. And the patient is classified as having SLE if the patient has at least 4 out of the 11 symptoms, either simultaneously or over time. So this includes findings like your malar rash, arthritis, renal involvement, hematologic abnormalities, ANA positivity. Next, you have your sleep criteria from 2012. This was developed to improve the sensitivity. Here, a patient needs at least four criteria with at least 1 clinical and 1 immunologic criteria. Or a biopsy-proven lupus nephritis with ANA or anti-dsDNA positivity. So the sleep criteria are more sensitive in pediatric SLE, making them particularly useful in children where presentations may be incomplete or evolving. However, this increased sensitivity may come with slightly lower specificity. Finally, we have the newest, the ACR-Euler criteria from 2019, which is the most updated system. This uses a 2-step approach. First, the patient must have a positive ANA as an entry criterion. Positive ANA must be at least 1:8. Okay? Then, different clinical and immunologic features are assigned in weighted scores. So there. and a total of 10 or more classifies the patient as having SL. So for me, in my clinical practice, I either use the ACR-Euler criteria or the SNCC criteria, because SNCC criteria has more studies in children. It's more sensitive to children. So the goal of therapy of patients with lupus are to ensure long-term survival, achieve the lowest possible disease activity, prevent organ damage, minimize drug toxicity, improve quality of life, and educate patients and their families about their role in disease management. Treatment of SLE is individualized, based upon the patient's preference, disease activity and severity, and comorbidities. Patients require monitoring at regular intervals by rheumatologists to optimize both non-pharmacologic and pharmacologic therapies and achieve treatment goals. Patients often have multi-organ system involvement, so they may require multidisciplinary care. So as I've said, management of SLE is based on disease severity and organ involvement with the goal of controlling inflammation while minimizing long-term toxicity. So first, we have your hydroxychloroquine, which is the cornerstone of treatment and should be given to almost all patients at a dose of less than 5 mg per kilogram per day. For mild disease, especially for your musculoskeletal symptoms, NSAIDs can be used for symptomatic relief. For moderate to severe diseases, glucocorticoids are the mainstay to rapidly control the inflammation. However, because of their side effects, we aim to reduce steroid exposure as much as possible. That is why we use steroid-sparing agents such as your mycophenolate mofetil, azathioprine, or methotrexate, depending on the organ involved. In more severe cases, especially in lupus nephritis or life-threatening disease, cyclophosphamide may be required. Finally, we have your biologic agents like your anti-CD20 rituximab, which is used in refractory or difficult-to-treat cases. So when you get to the wards, you will encounter our lupus patients mostly in using cyclophosphamide. Non-pharmacologic management is also a critical part of SLE care and works alongside medications to improve long-term outcomes. So it goes hand in hand with your pharmacologic management. So first is patient education, and shared decision-making are essential. Patients and families need to understand the disease, recognize the flares, and actively participate in care. Second is photoprotection, which is very important. UV exposure can trigger disease flares, so regular use of sunscreen and sun avoidance should be emphasized. Lifestyle modification also plays a key role. This includes smoking cessation, maintaining a regular physical activity, and improving overall health-related quality of life. In addition, since most of our patients are adolescents, psychosocial support is important, especially in children and adolescents, to address the stress, coping, and adherence. So overall, these measures are not a substitute for medications, but they significantly help in reducing the flares, improving the patient's quality of life, and optimizing disease control. Moving on, so we also have neonatal lupus erythematosus. NLE is an autoimmune disease in which placental transfer of anti-Rho and anti-La autoantibodies from the pregnant person with lupus to the fetus, resulting in fetal and neonatal disease. The major manifestations are cardiac and cutaneous finding. The most serious complication of neonatal lupus is a third-degree AV block. So here is an example. It's a picture of a patient with NLE. Look at the characteristic rash. So neonatal lupus is a passively acquired autoimmune condition caused by the transplacental transfer of maternal autoantibodies, particularly your anti-Rho and anti-La, and less commonly your anti-RNA. For diagnosis, we consider two key components. First, the mother has these autoantibodies, and second, the fetus or newborn develops characteristic findings, most importantly, your AB block, which can be permanent. Other features may include a typical rash, as you have seen a while ago, as well as hepatic or hematologic abnormalities in the absence of another explanation. So, because of the risk of cardiac involvement, screening and surveillance are very important. All at-risk pregnancies, especially all pregnant patients with lupus, should undergo maternal antibody screening, particularly for anti-Ro and anti-LAC, which is available in high precision. For the fetus, in utero monitoring is done using serial fetal echocardiography, specifically between the 18 to 25 weeks age of gestation, which is the critical period when the AB block develops. Early detection is important because it allows timely monitoring and a possible intervention. Management of neonatal lupus depends primarily on the type and severity of the organ involvement, especially cardiac disease. For cardiac involvement, particularly the first or second degree AB block, treatment with maternal glucocorticoids such as dexamethasone or betamethasone may be used to reduce inflammation and potentially prevent progression to complete block. However, once a third-degree AB block develops, it is usually irreversible, and these patients often require a permanent pacemaker after birth. So it will be a double setback once you diagnose the patient as having a complete heart block. For cutaneous manifestations, such as the typical lupus rash, these are generally self-limited and usually resolve spontaneously by around 6 to 8 months, as the maternal antibodies disappear. No specific treatment is usually required, but strict sun protection is advised to prevent worsening of the rash. Our next rheumatic disease is juvenile dermatomyositis or JDM. It is the most common form of idiopathic inflammatory myopathy in children, although overall it remains a rare condition. In terms of pathogenesis, the exact cause is still unknown. However, it is believed to be an autoimmune disease. The current understanding is that there is an immune-mediated attack on small blood vessels, particularly in the muscles and skin. This leads to inflammation, ischemia, and ultimately muscle weakness and characteristic skin findings. This process occurs in genetically susceptible individuals, where the innate immune system becomes activated, possibly triggered by infection or environmental factors. JDM typically presents with two hallmark features: symmetrical proximal muscle weakness and the characteristic skin rash. The muscle weakness primarily affects the proximal muscle, so patients may have difficulty climbing the stairs, getting up from a sitting position, or lifting their arms. The skin findings are very important for diagnosis. The classic rash is the heliotrope rash, which is a reddish purple discoloration over the eyelids, often associated with swelling. Please note also that this patient also have the malar rash. So not all patients with malar rash are lupus. You can see them also in juvenile dermatomyositis. Another key feature is the Gottron's papules, which are erythematous scaly lesions over the knuckles. So I hope you can see it well. Other skin and vascular findings include your nail fold capillary changes, this one, which can be seen with your dermatoscope, and in more severe cases, skin ulcerations reflecting underlying vasculopathy. Beyond the classic features, JDM can have systemic involvement. Patients may develop calcinosis. So as you can see here, the patient already has calcinosis. So this is a common complication of JDM.
ఈ వారమంతా ఇది ఉందంట.
More serious organ involvement would include your interstitial lung
ఏంటి
disease
హోలీ
and GI vasculopathy,
ఏమన్నా
which can be
రేపు మన
life-threatening and
చేస్తే
requires early
ఏదైనా
recognition.
అప్డేట్ ఇంకా లేదంటే నెక్స్ట్ మండే.
So when approaching a child with suspected juvenile
ఎట్లా
dermatomyositis, we often refer to the
16
bull-headed Peter criteria, which remains
ఆ
a
డేట్
classic
ఫిక్స్
framework for the
16
diagnosis. So as you can
ఈ
see,
డేట్లో
we
రావాలా.
still use this criteria, um, which we have been using since
నేను ఒక సబ్జెక్టు కంప్లీట్గా
1975.
అయిపోతుంది అనమాట.
So there are 5
ఈరోజు
key components
రేపు
to
ఒక
this
సబ్జెక్ట్
criteria.
అయిపోతుంది.
First
అది
is a
అయిపోయినాక
symmetrical
ఏప్రిల్ నుంచి ఏప్రిల్ 5 వరకు
proximal
సబ్జెక్ట్
muscle
ఉంటుంది.
weakness, which is typically the presenting feature.
హలో
Children may have difficulty climbing stairs, standing up, or raising their arms. Second, we look for elevated muscle enzymes such as your creatinine kinase, AST, ALT, and LDH, which reflects ongoing muscle inflammation. Third, we have your EMG, which may demonstrate a myopathic pattern supporting muscular involvement. And fourth, which I usually do not do unless I want to confirm the diagnosis, is a muscle biopsy, which shows perivascular atrophy and inflammation. And finally, the most important is the classic rash, which includes your heliotrope and goitrones. Management of JDM is based on the disease severity with early aggressive treatment to prevent the complications. So for mild to moderate disease, for most patients, we use a combination of high-dose glucocorticoid and methotrexate. We typically start oral prednisone at 2 mg per kilogram per day, given in divided doses for about 6 weeks, followed by a gradual taper. At the same time, we add our methotrexate, given once weekly. The key idea is early steroid plus steroid-sparing agent to control the disease and reduce long-term steroid toxicity. For severe diseases, in patients with severe or life-threatening disease, we escalate the therapy. We begin with IV pulse methylprednisolone at 30 mg per kilogram per day, maximum of 1 gram for 3 consecutive days, followed by oral steroids. Then we add your cyclophosphamide, typically for several cycles. If still with persistence of the symptoms, we may add IVIG or rituximab. Supportive would be a physiotherapy and like your glucose, sun protection, plus calcium with vitamin. Next disease is your juvenile scleroderma, which is a chronic multi-system connective tissue disease characterized by fibrosis or thickening and hardening of the skin and underlying tissues. In some patients, this process can extend beyond the skin to involve the internal organs, usually the GI tract, lungs, heart, and the kidneys. In children, scleroderma may present as either localized form, which mainly affect the skin, or systemic forms, which involves the internal organs and carry more significant morbidity. So as I've said, juvenile scleroderma is divided into 2 main types, localized and systemic. So localized disease or morphea is confined in the skin and sometimes different tissue without organ involvement. So here, in this picture, you have localized scleroderma of the head leading to hemifacial atrophy or your Pari-Romberg syndrome. And here you have the Enkudisab, linear depression of the forehead, and generalized morphea. In contrast, systemic sclerosis is a multi-system condition involving not only the skin, but also internal organs. Raynaud's phenomena is a key early features in organ involvement detecting severity. So how do we diagnose? In 2007, a multi-center, multinational group representing the Pediatric Rheumatology European Society, the ACR, and European Alliance of Association of Rheumatologists defined the nomenclature and criteria to diagnose and classify juvenile systemic scleroderma based upon the
Pinsan
clinical
na
research and
gawin.
laboratory parameters. So, in a patient less than 16 years
Ah,
of age, juvenile systemic scleroderma is diagnosed in the presence of
వచ్చేటోళ్ళే
the major
అంటున్నా వాళ్ళు.
criterion, which is your proximal sclerosis and induration of the skin,
పిలిచిన అయిపోయినా
and at least 2 to 20 minor criteria listed here.
పిలిచాల్సి ఉన్నాయి.
So here is your sclerodactyly and renal
పిలిచాల్సి
skin.
ఉన్నాయండి. ఎందుకు పిలిచింది?
Management of
పిలిచిన వాళ్ళే సగం మంది
scleroderma
రాకపోయారు.
is primarily
పిలిచిన వాళ్ళు
organ-based.
వస్తామంటారు.
So it is very difficult to treat.
ఎవరు?
We focus on symptomatic control and prevention of the complications. Patients with diffuse skin involvement or significant organ disease require systemic immunosuppression, typically using methotrexate or mycophenolate, depending on the organ involvement. More refractory cases may need biologics or cyclophosphamide. A key principle is
అన్ని
to avoid
చేయాలంటే కాదు, ఆ
glucocorticoids
ప్లేస్లో బెటర్.
whenever possible, as they increase the risk of renal crisis. Treatment is tailored to specific organ involvement. For example, ACE inhibitors for renal crisis, calcium channel blockers for Raynaud's, targeted therapy for pulmonary hypertension like your sildenafil and bosentan. GI, we use your PPIs, and ILD myocarditis, either we use cyclophosphamide, methotrexate, etc. or mycophenolate. Overall, the prognosis depends largely on the extent of organ involvement, with pulmonary and cardiac complications being the lead cause of mortality. So next, vasculitis refers to a group of disorders characterized by inflammation of the blood vessel walls. This inflammation can occur as a primary disease, meaning it arises on its own, or as a secondary process associated with other conditions such as infection, autoimmune diseases, or medication. The clinical presentation of vasculitis is highly variable. This depends largely on the size and type of the blood vessel involved, whether they are small, medium, or large vessels, as well as the location and extent of inflammation. As inflammation progresses, it can lead to damage of the vessel wall, resulting in narrowing, occlusion, or even aneurysm formation. These changes can significantly alter blood flow, leading to tissue ischemia or organ dysfunction. Because of this wide spectrum of manifestations, vasculitis can range from a mild self-limited disease to severe life-threatening conditions affecting major organ systems. So this is the Chapel-Hill classification that categorizes the vasculitis based on the size of the predominantly affected blood vessels. So, large vessel vasculitis involves the aorta and its major branches, such as in Takayasu arteritis. Medium vessel vasculitis affects the main visceral arteries, with example including your polyarteritis nodosa and Kawasaki disease. Small vessel vasculitis involves your arterioles, capillaries, and venules, and can be further divided into your ANCA-associated and your immune complex vasculitis. So for our first vasculitis is we have Kawasaki disease, which is one of the most common vasculitides of childhood, particularly in East Asian populations. It is the second most common vasculitis in children, next to IgA vasculitis, and importantly, it is the leading cause of acquired heart disease in children in developed countries. Note, developed countries, because in developing countries, rheumatic heart disease is the leading cause of acquired heart disease in children in developing countries. Clinically, Kawasaki is an acute self-limited inflammatory condition. If left untreated, the fever and associated inflammatory symptoms typically last for about 10 to 12 days. Despite being well recognized, the exact cause of Kawasaki remains unknown. It is thought to involve an abnormal immune response, possibly triggered by an infectious or environmental factor in genetically susceptible children. Because of its potential to affect the coronary arteries, early recognition and treatment are crucial to prevent the serious cardiac complications of Kawasaki. So this is the diagnostic criteria for Kawasaki disease. So you need to have fever lasting for at least 5 days
వాడు
without any other
మనతో బాగున్నప్పటి
explanation,
నుంచి కూడా అంటనే
combined with at
ఉంటాడు
least
అనమాట.
4 of the 5 following criteria. So you have your bilateral bulbar conjunctival injection,
మరి కదా అత్త చెప్పకుండా
your oral
వాడికి తెలియదు.
mucosal changes, your peripheral extremity changes, polymorphous rash, and your unilateral cervical lymph adenopathy of at least 1.5 cm in diameter. So this diagram shows how we approach a child with suspected Kawasaki disease. So we start with a child who has had a fever for at least 5 days without another clear cause. So this is when we consider, this is a trigger to consider Kawasaki disease. So from here, the next step is to assess how many of the clinical criteria are present. If the child has 4 or more clinical criteria, this is already consistent with Kawasaki disease. So we start the treatment right away. If there are only 2 to 3 criteria, this would be incomplete Kawasaki disease. So at this point, we check inflammatory markers such as your CRP and ESR. If these markers are low, Kawasaki is less likely, but we still monitor closely. However, if CRP or ESR is elevated, we then proceed to request for additional supplementary laboratories and do a 2D echo. So if the child has enough supportive lab findings or an abnormal echo, we treat the patient as having incomplete Kawasaki disease. If not, we just continue with close follow-up and reassessment. So what are the supplementary criteria? We have your hypoalbuminemia, thrombocytosis, anemia, biuria, and leukocytosis, and elevated liver enzymes. If the child has 0 to 1 clinical criterion, age becomes important. In infants 6 months or younger with prolonged fever, we maintain a high index of suspicion, obtain an echocardiogram, and manage accordingly. Because we have low tolerance for babies younger than 6 months. In older children, Kawasaki disease is less likely if you have 0 to 1 clinical criterion. But we still reassess if fever persists or new symptoms appear. So the next important step is to assess the patient's risk for IVIG resistance and development of coronary artery aneurysm. Risk stratification may differ depending on the population. For example, in Japanese patients, scoring systems such as the Kobayashi criteria are used to check for resistance, while in Northern American patients, factors like your coronary artery Z-scores, age, and CRP are considered. For patients who are not high risk, the standard initial treatment consists of 2 main components. First is your IVIG, intravenous immunoglobulin, given as a single dose of 2 grams per kilo over 8 to 12 hours. Second is aspirin, started at an anti-inflammatory dose at 30 to 50 milligrams per kilogram per day every 6 hours. Once the fever is resolved, aspirin is reduced to a low-dose antiplatelet regimen and continued for about 6 to 8 weeks depending if the patient has any coronary abnormalities. For patients identified as high risk for IVIG resistance, an intensified treatment approach is recommended. This still includes, of course, your IVIG and aspirin, but with the addition of another agent such as your corticosteroid. So this is a picture of a heart with coronary artery aneurysm. Kawasaki generally has an excellent prognosis, especially when treated early with intravenous immunoglobulin. Um, Usually, IVIG should be given within the 10 days of the patient's illness. So that is what we call our golden period. But if it surpasses the 10th day, we still give it for whatever it's worth. Because the coronary artery dilatation usually presents itself during the subacute phase of your disease. However, there are important exceptions to be aware. Very young infants may develop more aggressive disease, particularly severe coronary arteritis, placing them at risk for coronary artery rupture during the acute phase. Additionally, um, children who develop giant coronary artery aneurysms are at risk for long-term complication, including your stenosis and myocardial infarction. Because of this, the degree of coronary artery involvement is the most important factor in determining long-term outcomes. Fortunately, recurrence for Kawasaki is uncommon, but it happens. Next vasculitis is your IgA vasculitis. This condition is the most common form of vasculitis in children, typically occurring between the ages of 3 to 15 years of age. It is an immune-mediated disease characterized by the deposition of IgA immune complexes in small blood vessels. This deposition triggers complement activation and recruitment of neutrophils, leading to inflammation and damage to the vessel wall. As a result, patients develop the classic clinical features of small vessel vasculitis, particularly affecting the skin, joints, GI tract, and the kidneys. So let's go over the classification for IgA vasculitis. So the mandatory criterion is the presence of your palpable purpura. So this is an example of your palpable purpura. Usually this is seen in dependent portions of the body, such as your lower extremities, the buttocks, your back, the back, and the follicular area. So in addition, So in addition to these, at least one of the following criteria features must be present. First, your abdominal pain, abdominal pain, which is often colicky and may indicate GI involvement. Second is arthritis or arthralgia. Third is renal involvement, which may present as hematuria or proteinuria. And fourth is histopath showing IgA deposition in small vessels or in the glomeruli. Management of IgA vasculitis is primarily supportive, as most cases are self-limited. For mild disease, treatment focused on symptom control. This includes adequate hydration, rest, and analgesia, typically with paracetamol or NSAIDs for joint pain, provided there is no significant renal involvement. For patients with moderate disease, particularly those with significant abdominal pain or joint symptoms, we may use corticosteroids. Steroids can help reduce inflammation and shorten symptom duration, especially for GI manifestation, but it will not alter the course of your IgA vasculitis. So there is no treatment for it. We can only alleviate the symptom. In cases with severe disease, particularly renal involvement, such as persistent proteinuria or nephritis, management becomes more aggressive. This may include your high-dose corticosteroids and, in selected cases, immunosuppressive agents like your cyclophosphamide, azathioprine, or mycophenolate mofetil, depending on the severity and biopsy findings. IgA vasculitis generally has an excellent prognosis, especially in children without kidney involvement, with most cases resolving within 1 month. About 2/3 of the patients will not have a recurrence, while 1/3 may relapse, typically within the first few months. These recurrence are usually
Ah.
milder and shorter. Risk factors for
నేను
recurrence
ఇంకొకటి
include
రోల్ ఉండే
nephritis,
పెట్టింది చూడు నువ్వు
GI and
పెట్టిందని
joint
చూసినా ఎక్కడి
involvement, elevated inflammatory markers
నా
such as your
సంచి అది
ESR
బాగుంది
and
12
CRP,
రూపాయలేమో
and persistent hematuria. In the acute phase,
అది 12
which is your
రూపాయలు
GI phase,
నేను
morbidities
ఇంకొకటి
may lead to
ఇట్లా
their
రోల్
GI
చేసి
complications such
ఆ
as
పుట్లో రాత్రి
intussusception or
సందేశం
bleeding.
పంపించేటోళ్ళు చూడు
Long-term outcomes are largely determined by
అట్లా మూడొంది
kidney
ఒకటి పంపించిన
involvement.
చూడు
While overall prognosis remains favorable, some patients may develop
అంత
CKD or
లేదు
hypertension, especially those with severe initial renal
అది
findings.
నువ్వు చెప్పిండే
So what to watch out for
పెద్దది
IgA
ఇవి
vasculitis is
చిన్నవి
in the early phase, your GI
ఇందాకే చూస్తే
symptoms,
బాగానే ఉండే నేను కూడా
and your
నా
chronic
దాంట్లో
phase
సెలెక్ట్
would
ఉన్న
be
దాంట్లో
your
సేవ్ చేసి పెట్టుకున్నదాన్ని
nephritis. Next
ఎన్ని కార్డులు పట్టేయాలని మొత్తం
disease is your polyarteritis nodosa. It is a systemic necrotizing vasculitis that predominantly affects small to medium-sized
2000
arteries.
ఇది
The hallmark of the disease is inflammation of the vessel wall, which leads to weakening and the formation of aneurysms, predisposing patients to thrombosis, rupture, and organ ischemia. Clinically, patients often present with like almost all
అదొకటి
rheumatic diseases,
ఆ
non-specific
స్క్రోల్ది
systemic symptoms
ఒక
such as
500
fever, malaise,
50 రూపాయలు
and
కూడా
weight
అయితే
loss.
50
As the disease progresses, there is involvement of multiple organ
ఒక
systems.
100 50 నుంచి 100
Common manifestations include
ఇంకా
skin
కింద
findings like
సైజులు
libido reticularis,
అవి ఒక 1000
nodules,
1500
renal
పట్టించుకుంటే
involvement leading to
నార్మల్గా
hypertension, GI
ఊళ్ళో
symptoms
పంచేదానికి
such
ఒక
as
500
abdominal
వెయ్యి
pain,
400
and neurologic
పట్టించుకుంటే
features
సరిపోతుంది
like mononeuritis
ఆ,
and complex.
ఇవి ఇంకా 10 రూపాయలు
So to classify childhood polyarteritis nodosa, again we have our criteria which requires a mandatory evidence of either the histopathology or angiographic abnormalities, plus one of the
ఇంకోటి నేను
following
ఇంకోటి చూసిన
criteria.
ఒక 500 డబ్బా
First, the skin involvement, which would
500
include your
ఒకటి
libido reticularis. This is it.
అవి ఒక 10 చుట్టాలకాడికి మన అత్తలకాడికి అది ఇద్దామని
Ulcers or tissue necrosis. This is your tissue. This is actually it's a picture of, of my patient. As you can see, the tissue necrosis, and this is after treatment. So there was also amputation. Second is myalgia or muscle tenderness. Third, hypertension defined as blood pressure above the 95th percentile. Fourth is peripheral neuropathy, either sensory or motor, and fifth is renal involvement. Management of polyarteritis nodosa depends on disease severity. For non-severe PAN, treatment includes glucocorticoids, often combined with steroid-sparing agents such as methotrexate or azathioprine. For severe PAN, we divide the treatment into two phases. First is remission induction, which involves high-dose steroids, usually methylpred combined with cyclophosphamide to control the aggressive disease. Once remission is achieved, we shift to maintenance therapy using azathioprine or methotrexate to sustain the remission and minimize steroid exposure. Polyarteritis nodosa carries a poor prognosis if untreated, with only about 13% 5-year survival. However, with appropriate treatment, outcomes improve significantly, with survival rates increasing to around 80% at 5 years, largely due to the use of agents like your cyclophosphamide. Most deaths occur within the first 18 months, particularly in patients with severe organ involvement. The major causes of death are related to vascular complications, including renal failure, mesenteric infarction, myocardial infarction, and cerebral infarction. Barrett's vasculitis is one of the common large vessel vasculitis, which is your Takayasu disease, also commonly known as the pulseless disease. So this primarily affects the aorta and its major branches. The inflammation leads to thickening and narrowing of the vessel wall, resulting in reduced blood flow. Over time, this can cause stenosis, occlusion, or even aneurysm formation. Clinically, patients may present with weak or absent pulses, blood pressure discrepancies between limbs. So, in patients with rheumatologic diseases, I get blood pressure from all four limbs. Lymph claudication and symptoms of organ ischemia. So, Takayasu arteritis typically has a subacute onset which often leads to delayed diagnosis over months to years. Early in the disease, patients present with non-specific symptoms, fever, weight loss, fatigue, along with arthralgia or myalgia. As the disease progresses, large vessel inflammation leads to arterial narrowing and occlusion. This results in classic vascular findings such as your weak or absent pulses, lymph claudication, blood pressure discrepancies between arms, and arterial grooves. Clinical manifestations are largely due to organ ischemia. Patient may develop neurologic symptoms like dizziness or stroke, cardiac involvement such as angina, renal artery stenosis causing hypertension, and mesenteric ischemia presenting as abdominal pain. Other features include cardiotonia, skin lesions, and less commonly, pulmonary symptoms. So overall, the presentation evolves from systemic inflammation to vascular insufficiency. So these are the two commonly used classification criteria for Takayasu. So you have your ACR. Diagnosis is based on 6 features, and the presence of at least 3 out of the 6 classifies the patient as having Takayasu arteritis. So this includes age at onset less than 40 years, lymph claudication, BP difference of more than 10 mm mercury between arms, Lewy over the subclavian artery or aorta, abnormal arteriogram showing narrowing or occlusion. Then with the EULAR rest criteria, this is more structured and requires an absolute criterion. The absolute criterion is the angiographic abnormality of the aorta or its main branches. Yeah. So, in addition, at least one of the following is required: pulse deficit or claudication, blood pressure, discrepancy of more than 10 mm mercury, Lewy over the aorta, hypertension, and elevated acute phase reactant. So as you can see, this is an MRI showing narrowing of the region of the isthmus, this one, as well as the diffuse irregular narrowing of the abdominal aorta. Management of Takayasu arteritis depends on the disease severity. For mild active disease, treatment typically includes adalimumab combined with glucocorticoids. If adalimumab or your anti-TNF is not available or suitable, alternatives would include your methotrexate, leflunomide, or azathioprine. For moderate to severe cases, more aggressive therapy is required. This involves adalimumab, which is an anti-TNF again, with high-dose glucocorticoids to control inflammation rapidly. An important alternative to your adalimumab is your tocilizumab, especially in refractory cases or more severe cases. So overall treatment aims to control vascular inflammation early and prevent long-term complications such as stenosis and organ ischemia. So that ends my first lecture. I will now be moving to my final PowerPoint, which is juvenile idiopathic arthritis. So